Hello everyone, today we're exploring some chilling stories with a Soviet-era vibe straight off the Russian Creepypasta forums. Before we start, I'd really appreciate it if you could subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much. Sit back, get comfortable, and enjoy. I live in Akademgorodok, Novosibirsk. It's a heavenly place that has it all. Beautiful nature and well-developed infrastructure. And of course, my favorite railway machinery museum located just a 10-minute drive from the center, our upper zone. Ever since I was a kid, when I first saw my dad's old almanac dedicated to railways, trains, and steam locomotives in particular, I became absolutely obsessed with them. After reading it from cover to cover, I started pestering my parents, throwing tantrums and begging them to take me to that museum almost every weekend. There, I could wander for hours among the silent and, as it seemed to me then, massive behemoths that radiated the mystery of the miles and miles of tracks they had conquered. I imagined them hurtling through deserted fields day and night, crossing rivers, pulling a sleek chain of passenger or freight cars behind them. I have no idea why, but both then and now, all these imagined scenes seem not just interesting or beautiful to me, but genuinely thrilling. Unfortunately, my father didn't share my enthusiasm, so over time, as I got older, I started running there on my own, preferring my solitary trips over hanging out with the kids in the yard. Around that time, I got access to the internet, which opened up a ton of new possibilities. Now, I could quickly look up the history of any car in the museum and beyond, so eventually I dove headfirst into studying them, while still periodically visiting my old friends at the museum. That's when I met Denis Valerievich. The new night watchman was a good-natured guy, and we gradually formed something akin to a friendship, which blossomed on the fertile ground of our shared love for the history of railways and trains. He always had a story to tell, and I was the perfect listener. So we had a great time together, sitting for hours in his guardhouse, sipping tea and eating the candies I would sometimes bring along. The weirdness started in August 2007. The summer turned out to be scorching hot, well over 90 degrees Fahrenheit, so I didn't go to the museum much, preferring to stay in my cool apartment, only occasionally running down to the local beach with friends to tan. However, upon seeing an announcement on the website about a new exhibit, I decided to pay Denis Valerievich a visit and, of course, check out the new arrival. They had brought in a rather rare specimen, I must say, a Class Y freight steam locomotive built in the 1920s specifically for the Armavir Tuapse Railway. I couldn't find much information about it online, so right before a thorough inspection, I decided to drop by Uncle Dennis's place to discuss the beauty and maybe learn something new. As I mentioned, I hadn't made it out to the museum that summer, so I was expecting a warm, friendly welcome from my old pal. I was very surprised when, instead, I got only a gloomy look and a sullen, "Come in, it's baking out there." Sitting down at the small folding table in bewilderment, I watched as the watchman carefully took cups from a small wall cabinet without saying a word. Any other time he would have already been telling some new story from the life of the museum, which, admittedly, saw visitors fairly often, but this time he was strangely silent and depressed. When he sat down at the table too, I cautiously asked him what was wrong, to which I received only a vague wave of his hand, as if to say, "It's nothing important, forget it." We sat like that for a few minutes. I stared intently at the tea leaves while Denis Valerievich drummed his fingers a bit nervously on the edge of the table, occasionally taking loud slurps from his mug. I don't know why it took him so long to decide to tell me. Maybe he felt it was something worse than a usual tall tale, or maybe he just didn't want to come off as scared and superstitious. Whatever the case, he eventually did, and to this day, I'm not sure if I'm glad that I might know the true reason for everything that followed. "You're here to look at the new guy, aren't you?" He suddenly looked at me with such a tired gaze that I remember actually feeling sorry for him. "Well, yeah," I shrugged. "I was just really curious, to hell with the heat. I figured you'd be happy too. After all, we haven't had anything new in ages." Uncle Dennis just chuckled at this, twisting his yellowish nicotine-stained mustache. "I was happy, kid, right up until I found out exactly what they brought me. You've probably already read up on this locomotive, haven't you? Yeah, that sounds like you. Well, listen to what I have to tell you now. Don't get me wrong, I'm not a young man anymore, and it doesn't suit me to believe in scary stories, nor do I. But there is one story that's left a bad taste in my mouth since my youth, one I heard from my father. You remember he worked as a train driver for 9 years? Well, he worked exactly on the Armavir 2 Ops line. We moved out here much later. I was just a little kid when that incident happened, and of course I didn't find out about it right away. You know, I wish I'd never known anything about it at all. I have no idea why my old man even told me. It was back in '55, not long before the entire Y class was decommissioned. A very good friend of my father's drove one of these locomotives. They had been close almost from the start of his service, and one time, whether they were celebrating something or for some other reason, they got absolutely blind drunk, and this friend of his started running his mouth. He spilled that he was actually smuggling contraband, and that one time at the station, he and his assistant were inspecting the cars before departure to make sure they hadn't picked up any stowaways, and they stumbled upon a homeless street kid. There were a lot of orphans like that after the war. I never did figure out what they were transporting weighing hundreds of pounds, or how this poor kid found out what was in the crates. But one thing is clear, they couldn't risk leaving him alive. Too big of a risk. Even though the Khrushchev thaw had already begun, nobody had forgotten Stalin yet. What were they supposed to do with a kid at the station? Well, they whacked him on the head, dragged his 100-pound body to the locomotive and tossed him into the firebox. Said he burned alive in there. People are horrifying creatures. Denis Valerievich suddenly fell silent, staring at his empty mug. I was already starting to get a rough idea of where he was going with this, so I sat there barely breathing, waiting for him to continue and mulling over his last sentence. After a short while, he sighed and went on. My father said he had never sobered up so fast in his life. It was like he got smacked in the head, and his mind just, snap, cleared up, and the guy just kept pouring out his sins one after another. Must have been his conscience eating at him, which isn't surprising, because God knows how you carry something like that on your soul. It still blows my mind that this monster didn't hesitate to take a child's life to keep a secret. Yet, for some reason, he trusted my dad with it. A month after that conversation, his smuggling ring was busted and he disappeared. Probably took a bullet to the back of the head. That method hadn't entirely died out back then. And honestly, I never found out if he just slipped up somewhere himself, or if my father turned him in. Here, Uncle Dennis fell silent again. He stood up abruptly and walked over to a small refrigerator in the corner of the room. From the gap between the fridge and the wall, he fished out a small half-pint bottle, took a swig, and put it back. I'm not offering you any, kid. He chuckled again, sitting back down in his seat. I'll just tell you the point of my story. According to my dad, that locomotive started acting like a magnet for misfortune. First, something would break, then the driver would get sick inside it. All in all, there were a lot of nasty incidents, which led to everyone dubbing it jinxed. And earlier today, I was looking at our new exhibit and thinking that it's highly unlikely it's the exact same one. Things just don't happen like that. But my heart isn't at peace, you know? It feels like cats are scratching at my soul. I just can't shake it. All I could do was nod in silence. Leaving the guardhouse, I headed straight for the subject of our conversation. Now I was spurred on, not just by curiosity, but by a burning desire. With a mix of fear and some dark thrill, I hoped to find at least some trace of the horrific events of the past on the locomotive. But after crawling all over it, inch by inch, I found nothing that made it stand out from the rest. To my annoyance, the cab door was locked. Sighing, but still enjoying my examination of the wheels, steam dome, valves, steam-driven air pump, and other parts of this incredible machine, I finally got ready to head home. After walking several yards away, I turned around and took one last careful look at the locomotive. It didn't look the least bit sinister and didn't seem capable of hiding any dark secrets from the past. So, smiling, I turned back around and walked briskly toward the gates. I only paused briefly by the guardhouse, hoping for a proper goodbye with Uncle Dennis. But he never came out, so I headed toward the bus stop humming a simple tune, caught a minibus and didn't return there for a long time. Classes started up again in September. Hobbies are great, but I took my grades seriously, so my trips to the museum had to be put on hold for a while. The one time I decided to visit the old yet cozy guardhouse to shake off the autumn blues is something I will probably remember forever. It had been sunny all day, and only toward evening did a damp, bone-chilling wind pick up, pushing me along the path from the bus stop to the entrance gates. I wasn't even planning to go through them anyway, hoping instead to spend a couple of hours in Denis Valerievich's pleasant company with a mug of tea. Imagine my surprise when, instead of the slightly plump, cheerful man I knew, I saw a pale shadow of his former self. He had lost pounds of weight, looked exhausted with dark circles under his eyes. He appeared heavily aged and haggard. To be honest, he didn't even open the door for me. He just peeked out the window, slightly pulling back a dirty beige curtain someone had hung there ages ago. I remember feeling so uneasy that after shuffling my feet on the porch for a few minutes, I just went home. To this day, I can't figure out if I did the right thing. Maybe I should have stayed with him, talked to him, listened to him, calmed him down. Maybe it would have changed something, but that doesn't matter now. The next time I finally decided to find out what was going on, which wasn't until spring, Uncle Dennis wasn't at his post. Instead, the door was opened by a fairly young man looking about 40, who irritably announced that the previous watchman had died back in the winter. When I asked how it happened, he just gave a vague, slightly nervous shrug, muttered something about a heart attack, and waved his hand toward the museum entrance. What? I didn't quite catch the meaning of that last gesture. I'm saying they found him over there, lying in a snowdrift by one of the steam locomotives. He was already stiff as a board by the time they dug him out. God knows what he was doing out there in the middle of the night. The watchman suddenly gave me a suspicious look. What's it to you anyway, kid? Nothing. I knew him for a pretty long time, I mumbled in shock. At that, he cast another hostile glance my way and shut the door right in my face. Facing the death of someone I wasn't a stranger to for the first time, I felt utterly miserable and abandoned. Like in a trance, I tried to slip unnoticed onto the museum grounds to wander among the cars for a bit and clear my head. For some reason, I knew exactly where I needed to go and what I needed to look at. Slowly but surely, I passed several rows of passenger and freight locomotives until, finally, I stopped at the Class Y steam locomotive, the very one my unfortunate friend disliked so much. Just like a few months prior, I peered intently at the outlines of the pipes and valves, at the cab windows, at the number I-3205 on the tender, trying to catch something that I couldn't see now, but that Uncle Dennis had surely managed to see. I had no doubt about which locomotive he had been found next to. I stood there for quite a while until I was completely freezing. Then, shoving my hands into my pockets, I thoughtfully headed for the exit. But just as I was about to turn down another row, yielding to an inner urge, just like I had all that time ago, I looked back. A face was looking at me from the cab window. A little boy, 10 years old at most, pale, skinny, staring with such a heavy, impenetrable gaze that my heart felt like it caught fire for a second, only to immediately skip a beat and turn to ice. Putting in a tremendous amount of effort to tear my eyes away, I spun around and bolted. I don't think I had ever run so fast in my life. It's strange. After so many years of sincerely loving that place, I don't want to go there anymore. I haven't been there in about 5 years. My heart isn't at peace, you know? It feels like cats are scratching at my soul. I just can't shake it. The railway is a sort of country within a country, with its own rules, customs, and sometimes even laws. Its significance is especially great in wartime, when the situation on the front lines can directly depend on the work of railwaymen. Everyone, from an ordinary switchman to the Minister of Railways, is responsible for its smooth operation. And then, in such a well-oiled system, an extraordinary emergency suddenly occurs. A steam locomotive vanishes. A Class SU passenger locomotive was being transferred from Kaldim Station to Usovo Station. The distance of 47 miles is usually covered in 2 hours. When the locomotive did not arrive in Usovo after the estimated time, the station duty officer contacted his colleague in Kaldim. The latter confirmed that the locomotive had been dispatched exactly on schedule at 2:30 a.m. on the night of April 22nd to 23rd, 1944. Due to heavy fog, the driver had probably reduced speed, and it should be expected any minute. At that time, steam locomotives were not equipped with two-way radios, so there was no way to contact the crew. But all tracking systems indicated that the track was clear. Since an oncoming freight train was expected soon, the stretch was on a lateral branch of the Trans-Siberian Railway, and traffic on it wasn't particularly heavy. A motorized track car was sent down the line following the locomotive's route. It safely reached Usovo station without finding a single trace of the locomotive. The station masters, as well as the head of the railway section, were immediately notified. The locomotive couldn't just disappear. There were no side branches between Kaldym and Usovo, but it was gone. After the fog lifted during the day, they inspected every yard of the track, both by track car and on foot. There were no signs of a crash. The track was in perfect condition. Track walkers helped establish that the locomotive's disappearance occurred on the stretch between the small village of Boshchanovka, where trains never stopped, and the bridge over the Suzanka River. Railway workers combed this section of the track practically on their hands and knees. Nothing. They had to report it to the head of the railway. The commission, whose conclusions, by the way, served as grounds for a court-martial, was headed by a well-known railway signaling expert S.B. Tambovtsev, who later became a Stalin Prize laureate, a candidate of technical sciences, and a Director General of Traction, third rank. There were two main theories. First, the locomotive was never dispatched from Kaldym station. Second, the locomotive had actually arrived at Usovo station. In both cases, of course, there had to be malicious sabotage, which would have required the involvement of a vast circle of railway workers, from the station master down to the greaser. And not just from those stations. The locomotive would have to be moved somewhere, which implied a conspiracy across the entire line. But why? Locomotives themselves were valuable, of course. Enemies, saboteurs, and infiltrators sought to disable them. But to steal one? They spoke very carefully with the family members of the locomotive crew. As one might expect, their loved ones knew absolutely nothing. A covert search for the missing locomotive was conducted across all stations. To no avail. A locomotive isn't a needle. It simply can't slip past a dispatcher unnoticed. They checked abandoned, secret, and unfinished branch lines. The locomotive was nowhere to be found. The commission hit a dead end, and then Tambovtsev took a different approach. In an informal setting, he began asking train drivers and other rolling stock workers if any oddities had ever happened on the Kaldym-Usovo stretch before. People were extremely wary of his questions. One wrong word in those days could completely change your fate. Eventually, an old retired driver who had driven trains back under the Tsar, softened up by vodka and snacks, said that the stretch had a bad reputation. There were no crashes, the gradient was gentle, the track condition was good, but sometimes people saw all sorts of devilry on the tracks. Suddenly, instead of the railway line, there was a virgin forest, or conversely, cities grew around them. Sometimes watches suddenly fell an hour or two behind, or on the contrary, ran fast. Understandably, railwaymen kept quiet about this, otherwise they'd be suspected of drunkenness or mental illness and fired from the service. Tambovtsev pulled the records and discovered a strange anomaly. During the equinoxes, the number of delays increased sharply compared to ordinary days, and once in 1906, a freight train took 2 days to travel those ill-fated 47 miles. The authorities at the time considered this outright sabotage. The first Russian Revolution was sweeping the country, but there were no complaints from the receivers of the cargo, even though the livestock, cows, could easily have died over 2 days, or at the very least, starved. No, the condition of the cargo was rated as good. Furthermore, in their written explanations, the locomotive crew and the escorts unanimously claimed that they hadn't stopped anywhere and had traveled exactly the prescribed time, not an hour longer. All this was highly intriguing, but it didn't answer the question, where was the locomotive? And suddenly, news arrived from Usovo station. The locomotive had reached its destination, and by some miracle, its arrival hadn't resulted in a collision. An oncoming train was due to pass on the single track just 7 minutes later. The locomotive crew was immediately interrogated. All three of them, driver Shailov, assistant driver Yevseyev, and fireman Malyutny, expressed complete bewilderment over what had happened. According to them, they arrived exactly on schedule at 4:30 a.m. and the date was April 23rd. As proof, the driver presented his Moser, a remarkable watch with a calendar. It indeed showed 6 a.m. on April 23rd. An hour and a half had passed between their arrival and the interrogation. An inspection of the locomotive found no damage. Coal consumption matched standard rates, as did water consumption. The sealed speed recorder showed that the locomotive had traveled exactly 47 miles. A medical examination of the crew showed normal signs of fatigue, nothing more. Now, Tambovtsev had to decide whether an incredible hoax had occurred. For instance, the Germans or some other enemies had lifted the locomotive with a giant zeppelin, held it somewhere unknown just to mess with the railwaymen's nerves, and then suddenly brought it back. Or if some inexplicable natural phenomenon had taken place. As a materialist, Tambovtsev had to choose the first assumption. As a man who had seen a lot in his life, he leaned toward the second. Life, no less than Shakespeare, proves that there are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of in your philosophy. As an experienced railwayman, Tambovtsev chose a third option. In his report, he wrote that the locomotive's delay was caused by heavy fog, because of which the crew reduced speed to preserve the locomotive and pulled onto a siding to avoid a collision. In reality, this was total nonsense, of course, but on paper, the report was written flawlessly. This move proved to be correct. None of his higher-ups were interested in continuing the investigation, and the paperwork provided a reason to close it. And it was closed. Moreover, the locomotive crew received an official commendation for their selfless actions in preserving highly valuable state property, the locomotive, especially in wartime. Any rumors were nipped in the bud, and there really weren't any to begin with. Railwaymen are disciplined people, and the explanation that a secret operation had taken place, which only enemies would blab about, was enough for them. So those are the stories, guys. Let me know what you liked and what you didn't. Make sure to drop a comment with your thoughts on the stories and the video overall. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed it, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Also, be sure to check out my other videos. Catch you in the next one. Bye.